Do you even know who you just humiliated? The words hadn't been spoken yet, but in just a few minutes, they would echo through that park like a verdict no one could ignore. Officer Ryan Cole stood stiffly under the late afternoon sun, the badge on his chest catching the light, as if it carried authority beyond question. Around him, the park stretched wide and calm. Children laughing near a fountain, couples walking along paved paths, the scent of fresh-cut grass drifting through the air. It was the kind of peaceful suburban park where nothing was supposed to go wrong. And yet, something already had. Just moments earlier, everything had shifted. A woman stood a few feet away from him, her posture upright, her presence quiet but unshaken. Angela Brooks. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't resisted. She had simply stood there, composed in a way that didn't match the tension building around her. But to Ryan, that calmness felt like defiance. And defiance, in his mind, needed to be controlled. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to cooperate," he had said, his tone sharp, already assuming the worst. A small crowd had begun to gather, not close enough to intervene, but near enough to watch. Phones slowly lifted. Eyes locked in. No one spoke. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from uncertainty. Angela's gaze didn't waver. Not when he stepped closer. Not when his voice grew louder. Not even when the situation crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The fabric of her dress pulled slightly, then gave way with a soft, unmistakable sound. It wasn't loud, but in that moment, it might as well have been thunder. Conversations in the park died instantly. A child's laughter faded into confusion. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ryan exhaled, as if nothing significant had happened. As if this was routine. As if she was just another situation to manage. But Angela didn't react the way he expected. No shouting. No panic. No breakdown. Instead, she slowly adjusted her stance, shoulders back, chin level, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that felt different. Not fear. Not anger. Something deeper. Something controlled. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. The words were simple, calm, almost gentle, but they didn't land that way. Not to him. Not to the people watching. Because there was something in her voice, something that didn't match the role he had already assigned to her in his mind. Ryan scoffed, shaking his head, dismissing it as nothing more than another empty warning. He had heard those words before. Everyone said that. Everyone thought they were the exception. And yet, standing there in the middle of that quiet park, something had already begun to shift. Not visibly. Not yet. But beneath the surface, the balance of power was already moving. And none of them, not Ryan, not the silent crowd, not even the officers standing behind him, had any idea that in just a few minutes, everything they thought they understood about that moment was about to collapse. The silence did not break right away. It stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, as if the entire park was holding its breath waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. But no one did. Not the families nearby. Not the jogger who had stopped mid-stride. Not even the two officers standing behind Ryan who suddenly seemed unsure where to look. Because something about the moment no longer felt routine. It felt watched, recorded, remembered. And that changed everything. Ryan shifted his weight, forcing a confident posture as he glanced around at the growing number of phones pointed in his direction. The lenses small but powerful, each one capturing a version of the truth he could not control. "Step back and give us space," he said sharply, waving a hand toward the crowd. But his voice lacked the same certainty it had only seconds ago, because deep down, something had started to feel off. Angela remained still, her breathing steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, not defensive, not aggressive, just present. And that presence carried a quiet weight that did not match the way Ryan had already judged her. "I asked you to cooperate," he added, this time slower, as if repeating the line might restore control, but she did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked past him for just a moment, not in fear, not in search of help, but as if she already knew something he did not. Then her eyes returned to his, calm, unwavering. "I am cooperating," she said softly, and again. The words were simple, but they landed differently now, because the situation no longer matched his expectations. One of the officers behind him shifted uncomfortably, leaning closer. "Ryan, maybe we should just..." But Ryan cut him off with a quick glance, unwilling to lose authority in front of everyone watching. The crowd murmured quietly, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to create a low hum of tension that wrapped around the scene like static. Somewhere in the distance, a car door closed, sharp and distinct, not part of the park's usual rhythm. A few heads turned instinctively, but Ryan did not. Not yet. He was still focused on maintaining control of what he believed was a simple situation, yet the air had changed. It felt tighter, more deliberate, as if the moment was no longer unfolding randomly, but moving towards something inevitable. Angela seemed to feel it too, but unlike everyone else, she did not look surprised. She did not look anxious. If anything, she looked certain. "You still have time to fix this," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without drawing attention. And that was the moment something in Ryan's expression flickered, just for a second. Doubt. Not enough to stop him. Not enough to admit anything was wrong, but enough to register that this was no longer just another call. Behind him, the faint sound of engines grew closer, smooth, controlled, not hurried, but purposeful. The kind of movement that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway. A black vehicle rolled slowly along the curb bordering the park, followed by another, and then another. Their presence subtle but impossible to ignore. Conversations in the crowd faded again, replaced by a different kind of silence, one that did not come from confusion, but from recognition. And still, Ryan had not turned around, not yet, because in his mind, he was still the one in control, still the one with authority, still the one deciding how this would end. But the truth was already arriving behind him, and in just a few seconds, the version of power he believed in was about to be replaced by something far more real. Ryan heard the engines before he allowed himself to turn, a low controlled hum that did not belong to a casual visitor or a family arriving late to the park. This was different, deliberate, synchronized, and the moment he finally glanced over his shoulder, something inside him tightened in a way he could not immediately explain. 3 black vehicles had come to a precise stop along the curb, their polished surfaces reflecting the fading sunlight like mirrors, doors still closed, windows dark. And yet their presence alone shifted the entire atmosphere. The crowd felt it instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones steadied. Even the officers behind Ryan straightened without being told, because instinct recognized structure, and structure meant authority greater than their own. Angela did not turn. Not yet. She remained exactly where she was, her gaze still on Ryan, as if the arrival behind him was not a surprise, but an expectation already fulfilled. And that was what unsettled him most. Not the vehicles, not the crowd, but her calm, unwavering certainty. One of the rear doors opened with a quiet, almost understated click, not dramatic, not rushed, just enough to draw every eye toward it. A man stepped out, tall, composed, dressed in a dark tailored suit that fit with effortless precision. His presence alone commanded attention without needing to raise his voice, without needing to announce himself. And yet the effect was immediate. A ripple moved through the officers, subtle but undeniable. One of them whispered under his breath, barely audible, "That cannot be." But he did not finish the sentence, because he already knew. Ryan's jaw tightened as he turned fully now, his posture shifting from control to awareness, the kind of awareness that comes too late. The man took a few measured steps forward, not hurried, not aggressive, each movement deliberate, grounded, as if the space itself adjusted to accommodate him. Angela finally turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge his presence. And for the first time since this moment began, there was a change in her expression, not relief, not fear, but recognition, something familiar, something anchored. The man's eyes moved from the scene to her, then to Ryan, then to the officers behind him, taking in everything in a single glance, not missing a detail, not reacting emotionally, just observing, calculating, understanding. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but carried a weight that cut through the silence without effort. "Officer," he said, not loud, but clear enough that no one needed to lean in to hear. Ryan straightened instinctively, the word hitting differently now, not as a title of authority, but as a reminder of responsibility. What exactly is happening here? The question was simple, but it did not feel like a question. It felt like a line being drawn. Ryan opened his mouth, prepared to explain, to justify, to regain the narrative he had already lost. But the words did not come as easily as they had before, because now the situation no longer belonged to him. The crowd was no longer passive, the officers were no longer aligned, and Angela was no longer just a presence he could dismiss. She stood there, composed, silent, but everything around her had shifted in a way that made it clear she had never been what he assumed, not even for a second. One of the officers behind Ryan took a small step back, almost unconsciously, as if distancing himself from a moment that was beginning to unravel. The man in the suit glanced briefly toward Angela again, his expression softening for just a fraction of a second, then returning to its composed state as he faced Ryan once more. And in that moment, the realization began to form, slow, heavy, undeniable, not spoken, not confirmed, but felt, the kind of realization that does not arrive all at once, but builds piece by piece until it cannot be ignored. Ryan swallowed, his confidence no longer anchored, his authority no longer unquestioned, because standing in front of him was not just a man, and standing behind him was not just a situation. This was something else entirely, something far beyond the version of control he thought he held just minutes ago. And as the silence stretched once more, it was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of truth, preparing to reveal itself. Ryan felt the weight of every eye in the park shift away from him and toward the man standing just a few feet ahead. And for the first time since he had stepped into this situation, the badge on his chest no longer felt like protection. It felt like exposure. His mind searched quickly for control, for procedure, for anything that could restore the version of authority he had relied on moments ago. "Sir, we are handling a situation involving a non-compliant individual," he said, his voice steadier than he felt, carefully choosing each word. But even as he spoke, the sentence sounded smaller than it should have, like it no longer fit the reality unfolding around him. The man in the suit did not react immediately. He simply looked at Ryan, not with anger, not with impatience, but with a calm focus that made the explanation feel incomplete before it had even finished. "Non-compliant," he repeated quietly, as if testing the accuracy of the word itself. His eyes then moved slowly toward Angela, taking in her posture, her composure, the quiet dignity she maintained despite everything that had just happened. And when his gaze returned to Ryan, something in the air tightened again, not louder, not sharper, just heavier, more final. "I would like you to explain," he said, each word deliberate, "how standing still and speaking calmly qualifies as non-compliance." The question landed with precision, not raised in volume, but impossible to dismiss. One of the officers behind Ryan shifted again, this time more noticeably, the tension no longer something they could ignore. Ryan hesitated, just for a second, but that second stretched long enough for everyone to feel it. "She refused to follow instructions," he replied. But the confidence was gone now, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain. Angela did not interrupt. She did not argue. She simply stood there, her presence speaking louder than any defense could. The man in the suit nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the response, but not accepting it. "And those instructions required what exactly?" he asked, his tone unchanged. Ryan opened his mouth again, but the words did not come as quickly this time, because now he was being asked to define something that had never been clearly justified. The moment replayed in his mind, the assumptions, the tone, the escalation, none of it as solid as it had felt before. "We believed she was causing a disturbance," he said finally, and even he could hear the weakness in it, the lack of substance, the absence of certainty. The man's expression did not change, but his next words carried a quiet finality that settled over the entire park. "Belief," he said, "is not the same as fact." The sentence hung in the air, simple, undeniable, and suddenly the space between authority and accountability felt very real. Angela's eyes remained steady, not on the crowd, not on the officers, but on Ryan, as if giving him one last chance to understand what he had failed to see from the beginning. The man in the suit took one small step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to make it clear that this moment was no longer informal, no longer uncertain. It had become something official, something measured. "Officer," he said again, this time with a weight that carried beyond the word itself, "I suggest you take a moment and reconsider everything you think you know about this situation." Ryan swallowed, his throat dry, his thoughts no longer aligned, because the ground beneath him had shifted completely, and there was no way to stand on it the same way again. The crowd was silent now. Not curious, not confused, but aware that something important was unfolding, something that would not be undone or ignored. And in the center of it all stood Angela, calm, composed, unchanged, as if she had never been out of place at all, as if the only thing that had been wrong from the start was the way she had been seen. The words settled over Ryan like a weight he could not shake, not loud, not aggressive, but impossible to ignore. And for the first time since he had stepped into the park that afternoon, he realized that control was no longer his to hold. It had shifted quietly, steadily, without force, and now it stood in front of him in a form he could not command. He glanced briefly at the officers behind him, searching for reinforcement, for agreement, for anything that might restore the structure he was used to, but their expressions had changed, no longer aligned, no longer certain. One of them avoided his eyes entirely. Another stood still with his jaw tight, as if already understanding what Ryan was only beginning to grasp. The man in the suit did not raise his voice, did not step closer again. He simply reached into his jacket with a calm, measured motion and produced a small identification wallet, opening it just enough for Ryan to see. No dramatic gesture, no need for emphasis, because the effect was immediate. Ryan's posture shifted before his mind could catch up, his shoulders tightening, his stance no longer firm but rigid, uncertain. The air around them seemed to compress, as if the entire park had leaned in at once. Even the faint sounds of the city beyond the trees felt distant now, muted under the weight of what had just been revealed. The man closed the wallet and returned it to his pocket without a word, because he did not need to explain what it meant, not to Ryan, not to anyone watching. The recognition had already taken hold, slow but undeniable. Ryan swallowed, his throat dry, his thoughts scrambling to reorganize the moment, to reinterpret everything that had happened in the last several minutes. But the sequence did not change, only his understanding of it did. Angela remained where she was, calm, steady, her presence unchanged, as if nothing about her had ever been uncertain, as if the only thing that had shifted was the way others were now forced to see her. The man turned slightly toward her, his expression softening again, not publicly, not for show, just a brief moment of acknowledgement that carried something deeper than words. "Angela," he said quietly, and that was when the final piece fell into place, not announced, not declared, but fell across the entire space like a silent confirmation. The name alone, spoken with that level of familiarity, that level of respect, connected everything Ryan had failed to recognize from the beginning. A low murmur moved through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. People exchanging glances, phones adjusting angles, the realization spreading from one person to the next like a quiet wave. The officers behind Ryan straightened further now, not out of discipline, but out of instinct, because they understood what stood before them, even if no one had said it out loud yet. Ryan's mind raced, searching for the right response, the correct protocol, the way to step back without collapsing entirely. "Sir, I did not realize," he began, but the sentence faltered before it could finish, because realization was not the issue, and deep down, he knew it. The man's gaze returned to him, steady, composed, not angry, but resolute. "No," he said calmly, cutting through the unfinished words without raising his tone. "You did not take the time to realize." The correction was precise, not emotional, not exaggerated, just accurate, and that accuracy carried more weight than any accusation could. Ryan's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension in his stance unraveling as the truth settled in fully. There was no recovering the moment, no reframing it, no controlling how it would be seen, because it had already been witnessed, recorded, understood. The man let the silence sit for a second longer, not rushing, not forcing the next step, because he did not need to. The situation was already moving forward on its own. "I am Governor Daniel Brooks," he said finally, his voice steady, measured, leaving no room for doubt, no room for misinterpretation. And in that instant, everything that had felt uncertain became clear. Everything that had seemed routine revealed itself as something else entirely, something far more serious, far more permanent. Ryan lowered his gaze, just slightly, not out of submission, but out of recognition, the kind that comes too late to change what has already been done. And beside him, Angela stood exactly as she had from the beginning, calm, dignified, untouched by the chaos that had tried to define her, because she had never needed to prove who she was. The truth had simply arrived, and now it was impossible to ignore. The name did not echo loudly, but it did not need to, because the impact moved faster than sound. It traveled through posture, through silence, through the sudden stillness of everyone present. Governor Daniel Brooks stood firm, not imposing, not aggressive, but undeniable, and beside him, Angela Brooks remained exactly where she had always been, unchanged, as if the world had finally caught up to a truth she had never needed to announce. Ryan felt the shift completely now, not just around him, but within him. The certainty he had carried earlier was gone, replaced by a clarity that came too late to prevent the consequences unfolding in front of him. He straightened instinctively, not out of authority, but out of awareness. "Governor, he began. But again the words failed to carry the weight they needed, because there was no sentence that could undo what had already been witnessed. Daniel did not interrupt immediately. He allowed the unfinished words to fade on their own, giving the moment space to settle, because silence, in this case, said more than any response could. Angela shifted her gaze slightly, not toward the crowd, not toward the officers, but toward Daniel, her expression still composed. But now there was something else beneath it, not relief, not validation, but a quiet recognition that the moment had reached its turning point. Daniel nodded subtly toward her, a gesture small enough that most would miss it, but meaningful enough that it carried everything it needed to. Then his attention returned fully to Ryan. "Officer Cole," he said calmly, addressing him by name now, and that alone carried a weight that tightened Ryan's chest, because it meant this was no longer a general situation. It was specific, recorded, and remembered. "I want you to take a step back," Daniel continued, not raising his voice, not issuing a command in the way Ryan was used to, but stating it in a tone that did not invite resistance. Ryan hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stepping back, the movement small, but symbolic, the first visible acknowledgement that control had shifted completely. The officers behind him followed without being told, creating a space that had not existed before, a space where Angela stood no longer surrounded, but centered. Daniel turned slightly, gesturing toward one of the individuals who had stepped out of the vehicles earlier, a man holding a small device in his hand, not intrusive, not obvious, but present. "Everything that has occurred here has been documented," Daniel said evenly, his words directed not just at Ryan, but at everyone within earshot. The statement settled heavily, not as a threat, but as a fact, one that could not be argued or dismissed. Ryan's mind raced again, not searching for control this time, but for understanding, for the exact point where everything had gone wrong. But the truth was, it had not been a single moment. It had been a series of assumptions, each one building on the last until they created a reality that no longer held. Angela finally spoke again, her voice steady, clear, not raised, but strong enough to carry across the quiet space. "I asked you to listen," she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating what had already been said. And in that moment, her earlier words returned with a new weight, not as a warning, but as a truth that had been ignored. Ryan nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to defend. The crowd remained silent, not out of uncertainty now, but out of understanding, because what they were witnessing was no longer confusion. It was accountability unfolding in real time. Daniel took one step forward, positioning himself beside Angela, not in front of her, not shielding her, but standing with her, equal, aligned. "This moment," he said calmly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the gathering, "is not about titles." He paused briefly, allowing the words to settle. "It is about how people are treated when no one thinks it matters." The sentence hung in the air, heavier than anything that had been said before, because it reached beyond the situation itself, beyond the individuals involved, and touched something deeper, something that could not be easily dismissed or forgotten. Ryan lowered his gaze again, not out of submission, but out of recognition, because he understood now, fully, that this moment was no longer his to control. It never had been, and as the quiet of the park returned, not peaceful, but aware, one thing had become undeniable. The truth did not arrive with noise, it arrived with clarity, and once it was seen, it could not be unseen. No one moved right away, not because they were unsure of what to do, but because the moment itself demanded stillness, the kind that forces people to sit with what they have just witnessed, not rush past it, not explain it away, but feel it fully. Ryan stood there with his hands at his sides, no longer directing, no longer commanding, just present in a reality that had shifted beyond his control. The officers behind him mirrored that stillness, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness that this was no longer a routine call. It was something that would follow them long after the park returned to normal. Daniel remained composed, his posture steady, his presence grounding the moment rather than escalating it. Because this was not about creating a scene, it was about revealing one that had already happened. Angela took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but as if acknowledging that the weight of the moment had finally settled where it belonged. Her eyes moved briefly across the crowd, not searching for sympathy, not demanding attention, just recognizing the witnesses who had seen everything unfold. And in their silence, there was now a different kind of energy, not passive, not indifferent, but reflective. People were no longer just watching, they were understanding. One of the individuals standing near the vehicles stepped forward slightly, holding a phone, not raised high, not intrusive, but clearly recording, capturing not just the event, but the aftermath, the part where truth reshapes perception. Daniel's voice broke the silence again. Calm, measured. Accountability does not begin when someone important arrives, he said, his words directed outward, not just to Ryan, but to everyone present. It begins the moment a choice is made. The sentence carried through the air with quiet authority, not meant to shame, but to clarify. Ryan lifted his gaze slightly, meeting Daniel's eyes for a brief second, and in that moment, there was no resistance left, only recognition, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to defend. I understand, Ryan said quietly, the words simple, stripped of any attempt to justify or explain, because he knew now that explanation was not what this moment required. It required acknowledgement. One of the officers behind him stepped forward just enough to speak, his voice careful, respectful. Governor, we will report this immediately and follow all procedures. Daniel nodded once, not approving, not dismissing, simply acknowledging that the next steps were already in motion. Angela turned her attention back to Ryan, her expression still composed, still steady, but now there was a clarity in her eyes that had not needed to prove itself. What matters, she said softly, is not what happens next for me. She paused briefly, letting the words settle. It is what happens next for everyone else who does not have someone arriving for them. The sentence landed deeper than anything before it, because it shifted the focus beyond the moment, beyond her, into something broader, something that could not be contained within this single scene. The crowd absorbed it in silence, the weight of it settling differently for each person, some lowering their phones, others holding them tighter, as if realizing that what they had captured was more than just an incident. It was a reflection. Daniel glanced at Angela, a brief look of respect passing between them, not spoken, not displayed, just understood. Then he turned back to Ryan one final time. This is where it changes, he said calmly, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. Ryan nodded again, slower this time, the movement carrying more than agreement. It carried acceptance. And as the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the park, the moment that had begun with assumption ended with something far more lasting. Not noise, not confrontation, but clarity. The kind that does not fade when the crowd disperses, the kind that stays, quiet but permanent, reminding everyone who stood there that day that power is not proven by control, but revealed by truth. The park did not return to normal right away, even as the immediate tension began to ease, because something deeper had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not simply be undone by time or distance. People remained where they were, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of reflection, as if leaving too quickly would mean missing the meaning of what had just unfolded. Ryan stood quietly, his earlier authority now replaced with a stillness that felt heavier than any command he had given before, his thoughts no longer racing, but settling into a realization that was far more difficult to face, that this moment would not end when the crowd dispersed. It would follow him. In reports, in conversations, in memory. One of the officers beside him finally spoke in a low voice, not to challenge, not to defend, but to acknowledge. We will make sure this is documented exactly as it happened. And for the first time, the words sounded less like procedure and more like responsibility. Daniel gave a slight nod, not as approval, but as confirmation that the process had already begun, because accountability was no longer optional. It was inevitable. Angela shifted her stance slightly, not retreating, not stepping forward, just repositioning herself with the same quiet control she had maintained from the beginning. The breeze moved gently through the trees, lifting the edges of leaves, carrying with it the faint sounds of the city beyond the park, a reminder that the world outside this moment continued, even as everything inside it had changed. A woman in the crowd lowered her phone slowly, her expression thoughtful, as if she had come to witness something unexpected and was now leaving with something far more lasting. A young boy standing beside his father looked up and asked a question too quiet for others to hear, and the father paused before answering, choosing his words carefully, because even he understood that what had happened here required more than a simple explanation. Daniel turned slightly toward Angela again, his voice softer now, meant only for her. "Are you all right?" he asked, not out of doubt, but out of respect. Angela nodded once, her expression calm. "I am," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice, because her strength had never depended on the situation, only on her understanding of it. Daniel studied her for a brief moment, then gave a small nod in return, a silent exchange that carried more than concern. It carried recognition, respect, and something deeper that did not need to be spoken. Ryan took a slow breath, stepping forward just enough to be heard without interrupting. "Governor, ma'am," he said carefully, his tone no longer authoritative, but measured. "There is no excuse for what happened." The admission was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried a weight that could not be mistaken, because it came without justification, without condition, just a statement of fact. Angela looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with clarity, as if seeing him not as he had acted, but as he now understood himself to be. "Then let it change something," she said quietly. The words simple, but carrying a depth that reached beyond the moment itself. Ryan nodded once, slower this time, because he understood that this was not about ending the situation, it was about what came after. The officers around him stood straighter now, not in defense, but in awareness, because they too understood that they had witnessed something that would shape how they moved forward. Daniel stepped back slightly, allowing space to return to the scene, not to erase what had happened, but to let it settle into something real, something lasting. The vehicles behind him remained still, their presence no longer dramatic, but steady, as if they had always been part of the background, waiting for the moment to unfold. The crowd began to disperse slowly, not in a rush, but in quiet reflection, each person carrying their own version of what they had seen, what they had felt, what they would remember. And in the center of it all, Angela stood for one last moment, looking out across the park, not searching, not questioning, just present, because she had never needed to fight for recognition. She had only needed the truth to arrive, and now that it had, it would not leave with the fading light of the afternoon. It would remain, carried forward by every person who had witnessed it, by every voice that would share it, by every moment that would be shaped by what had been learned here. Because sometimes justice does not come with force, it comes with clarity, and once it is seen, it changes everything. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the park, and with it came a quiet that felt different from before, not empty, not uncertain, but settled, as if the space itself had absorbed everything that had happened and was now holding it in place. Angela took one final look around, not at the officers, not at the crowd that was now thinning into small clusters, but at the park itself, the same place that only minutes ago had tried to redefine her, and yet had ultimately revealed something far greater than the moment it contained. She adjusted her posture slightly, her presence unchanged, her dignity never lost, because it had never depended on how she was treated, only on who she knew herself to be. Beside her, Daniel stood with the same quiet composure, not as a figure of authority in that moment, but as a witness to what had been exposed. He glanced toward the officers one last time, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a clarity that required no further explanation, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made visible. Ryan remained where he was, watching as the scene slowly returned to motion around him. People walking again, voices rising softly, the normal rhythm of the park attempting to resume. But he knew it would never feel the same, not for him, not after understanding how quickly perception can shape reality, and how easily that reality can be wrong. He took a slow breath, not to steady himself, but to acknowledge that what had happened would follow him, not as punishment, but as a reminder, a line that could not be crossed again without consequence. Angela turned slightly, her gaze meeting his for just a brief moment, not lingering, not heavy, just enough to leave something behind, something he would carry long after she walked away. And then she did, not hurried, not hesitant, just a calm step forward, followed by another. Daniel moving beside her, not leading, not shielding, simply walking with her, equal, aligned. As they made their way toward the vehicles waiting at the edge of the park, the doors opened quietly, without spectacle, without urgency, and as they stepped inside, the scene did not erupt, it did not shift dramatically. It simply continued, because the real change had already happened. The vehicles pulled away smoothly, blending back into the rhythm of the street, leaving behind a park that looked the same, but was not. Ryan stood there for a moment longer before turning to the officers beside him, his voice quieter now, not commanding, but clear. "Make sure everything is reported exactly as it happened," he said. And this time, the words carried meaning beyond procedure, because they were rooted in understanding. The officers nodded, not out of obligation, but agreement, because they too had seen what had unfolded, and they knew it mattered. As the last of the crowd dispersed, the park returned to its ordinary sounds, laughter, footsteps, distant conversation, but beneath it all, something remained, something invisible but permanent, a shift in awareness, a reminder carried by those who had witnessed it, that authority without understanding is fragile, and that truth does not need to announce itself to be powerful. It only needs the moment to be seen, and once it is, it leaves behind something that cannot be undone, a quiet, undeniable echo that stays long after everything else has moved on. Because in the end, he thought he was in control of the moment, but the moment was never his to control. It belonged to the truth, and the truth had already decided how it would end.